I'm Charlie Smith, and I was asked why I came to town. Well, we've got a problem here in the state of Tennessee, and in the rest of the states, and we're going to try to solve a problem. What we've discovered is that at least 70% of all the money collected by the state governments and by the local and the little communities, 70% of that money is spent on federally mandated programs. And what that means is that the ordinary people have to pay more and more taxes to carry out police functions and fire functions. And when the local governments try to raise your taxes, people begin to protest, and eventually the state will be required to put in a state income tax, which is something nobody wants. That is to make up the deficit. And then that begins to balloon too, because the federal programs get bigger and bigger and bigger. And the question becomes, how do you stop it? What can we do? Well, to understand what the problem is, you have to realize that the problem is caused by Washington, D.C. What's been happening for the last 20 years, 30 years, is that the federal government develops programs, they push those programs into the state, and then the state is required to finance the programs. So your taxes go up. Well, if you want to stop that, you can't look at the state government. They're not going to stop it. You have to look at Washington, D.C. And if you say, how can we stop it? You say, who's doing the taxing? And it turns out that only one department of government is responsible for taxing the American people, and that is the U.S. House of Representatives. The Senate doesn't control any money. The President controls none. The court controls none. All taxes are imposed on the American people by the House of Representatives, which is to say, if you're going to control the size, the cost, reach, or the power of government, if you're going to reduce those things, you must get control of the House of Representatives. So the question becomes, well, how do you do that? You see, there are many, many people who vote every election, and they vote for a Republican or a Democrat, and they vote for men who promise to give them smaller government, going to abolish this program and that program. And what happens instead is that every election, after the election, the taxes go up. The budget gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And people say, well, it's useless. So how do you solve the problem? Well, to solve the problem, you have to ask yourself, what's causing it? And what's causing it is this. The Democrats and Republicans, the two parties, are in control of the primary system. You see, the Achilles heel of the American Constitution is the primary system. We have 2 elections in this country, but we really only have 1. Now, in the primaries, what happens is that the Democrats pick an opportunist or a socialist to run as a so-called moderate or liberal Democrat. The Republicans, who are the same people, pick a so-called moderate or conservative person to run as a Republican. But both these candidates are picked by the same group of people. They pretend to be different, but they aren't. The net result is that when you have the primary, lots of money is put behind socialist candidate A and socialist candidate B. When the primary is over, you have a hand-picked stooge running as a Democrat and a hand-picked stooge running as a Republican. You've lost the election in the primaries. You see, if you don't get your candidate through the primary, you don't have a candidate in November. Now, everybody knows that. And what's taking place, and what's taken place for years, is that these same politicians who chose those candidates come to the American people and say, well, I don't like either one of them. Pick the lesser of the evils. There is no church in this country that teaches you to vote for something which you know to be evil. But that's what they're doing to you. So if we're going to turn this country around, we have to get candidates through the primaries. Otherwise, you have no chance in November. The question becomes, how do you do it? Well, that's why I came to town. we've launched a movement, and we're going to spread it across the country, to reduce the size of government, and the way we have to do it is by running 2 candidates for each political office. These candidates are going to be pledged to do one thing and one thing only, that is to vote no on everything. You say, well, if they vote no on everything, you get nothing done. That's good. Well, how can that be good? Well, every bill coming up in every session of Congress increases the size, the cost, the reach, and the power of government. If you get nothing done, it means you pass none of those bills. That's good. These men are going to be pledged to vote no on any piece of legislation which would increase the size, the cost, the reach, or the power of government at any level. Now, you say to yourself, well, isn't that negative, or how can you win with something like that? So imagine that you're a candidate, and you're going to be involved in a debate. Here sits the hand-picked stooge. This is in the primaries. Here sits the hand-picked stooge for the Democrats. Here's the hand-picked stooge for the Republicans. And here you sit. They're asked a question, and they ask the Republican, how are you going to vote on this bill? And he gives an answer. They ask the Democrat, he gives an answer. And the only difference between what the Republican says and what the Democrat says is that one of them says the bill should cost $50 billion, the other one says it should cost $20 billion, and they compromise and it costs $35 billion. Well, if you're the other candidate, you ask this first one, would that bill increase the size, the cost, the reach, or the power of government? And the answer is yes. You ask the Republican, would that bill increase the size, the cost, the reach, or the power of government? The answer is yes. That's what they're doing. That is exactly what they're doing. They pretend to fight each other, but they're not. They're giving us more and more government. Now, these congressmen or these candidates are going to vote the way the party wants them to vote, because the party bosses are the ones who picked them to run in the first place. So in a campaign, you have this man saying, I'm against this movement, I'm against this bill, and they promise to vote no on these bills. And they do. You say, well, doesn't that make them what you want? And the answer is no. I want to tell you something. In order to find out what these men are doing, what you're going to discover is that these so-called conservatives who claim to be for smaller government, they come around and say they're going to help abolish this. They're going to trim this program and trim that program, and they actually put up bills to do that. The bills don't pass. In other words, they vote against the program, but the bill still passes. When they are elected, and it comes time to vote to finance the programs, the very same men who came to you and said they were against these bills vote to finance the bills. That's the key to this thing. If you want to know who in our government wants a smaller government and who's voting for bigger government, don't look at their votes on the bills. Look at their votes on the budget. It makes no sense for a candidate to say he's against something and then to turn around and vote to finance it. That's the way you lose. But they come back and say, I did all we could, we tried, couldn't get it done. That's nonsense. They should have voted no on the budget. That would indicate that you actually want the government to become smaller. Now, to understand that this is what these programs do, is give us more government, look at the recently passed Homeland Security bill. That bill was a huge increase in the size, the cost, the reach, and the power of government. And to understand how this bill came about, You got to remember that Bill Clinton put up the same bill. It didn't pass. He put it up several times. It didn't pass. It had the same provisions. But like all the other shenanigans that the communists pull, when they have a bill that doesn't pass, they make a crisis. And when the crisis occurs, they stampede the Congress and stampede the people into accepting something which was not acceptable in the first place. This is what they did with Homeland Security. So this is a well-developed technique, and to get you to understand how this works and how we can stop it, we have to look backwards at something which we all experienced. This would be the movement in the 1960s with Martin Luther King. Now, I want to use this example not because of race, but because everybody lived through that, and it's far enough away, and you can get it in perspective, see what he was doing. Martin Luther King called his program nonviolence. And so you ask, what was nonviolence? Well, Martin Luther King, in an article in 1965, in the August 15th issue of the Saturday Review of Literature, said what nonviolence was. It was a four-step program. Now, these are his words. The first step was nonviolent demonstrators going through the streets to exercise their constitutional rights. Step two was racists resist by unleashing violence against them. Step three was Americans of conscience, in the name of decency, demand legislation and court decisions. And step four was, in this crisis atmosphere, the legislation is passed and the court decisions are made. Those were King's own words. His program, called Nonviolence, was a four-step program, actually a two-step program. Create the violence and the crisis and advocate the solution. That's what his program was. Now, you recall, to examine how that actually worked, we go back to the passage of the so-called 1964 Civil Rights Act. Remember how that was done. Remember, you're going to create a crisis and advocate a solution. You recall that the Freedom Rides began in 1961. There was turmoil in the South. King was preaching and marching. John Kennedy became president, and he, of course, masqueraded as a great white liberal. Well, in 1962, a so-called Civil Rights Act was stuck up. It didn't pass. Kennedy supposedly crusaded for this passage of the Civil Rights Act. It didn't pass. In the spring of 1963, somebody put a bomb in a church down in Alabama, blew up the church and killed 4 little girls. So there was a push. We got to have the Civil Rights Act. It still didn't pass. In the fall of 1963, Kennedy was killed. In 1964, 3 civil rights workers, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, were sacrificed. You see, the American people had to be pushed, so the violence had to escalate. So beyond the beatings and things like that, and the murders which had already taken place, you had to have another murder, something to grab the attention of the people, a crisis, so they would fear what was going to come after that. And in this crisis atmosphere, the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed. It was a huge expansion of the federal government. 1/1000th of 1% civil rights, and 99.999% a huge expansion of the federal government. That was the one act. Now, once that ball began rolling, the second act, along the same lines, one was the enabling legislation. The second act occurred when Lyndon Johnson, after the demonstrations and some of the riots, Lyndon Johnson made that famous speech, or infamous speech, in which he said, "And these enemies too, the ancient enemies of mankind, poverty, disease, and ignorance, we shall overcome." We all heard that speech. Now look, what is the liberal solution for poverty? Welfare. What is the cure for ignorance? education. What's the opposite of disease? Health. Health, education, and welfare. That is the department of government they were expanding. That's the way this con game works. You make the crisis and advocate a solution. And the people who made the crisis are the ones appointed to the positions in the government. But you notice here that the House of Representatives, which is what we're talking about here and voting in this stuff, these are the guys who are stampeded, who don't have the backbone to say what's going on and say no. They don't have the spine. That's because in order to be elected, they have to kowtow to the party bosses. They're depending on the party bosses to pick them and finance them and run them for office. A politician's first job is to be reelected, to be elected. His second job is to be reelected. His second job is to be reelected. His second job is to be reelected. He's always running for office. But he has to keep catering and kowtowing to the bosses so they will keep giving him the money and financing him. Now, the second thing was this huge government expansion program was that so-called war on poverty. The actual name of that thing was the Economic Program of the Communist Party USA. That was the actual title of the thing. Then they changed the name to the War on Poverty. The third element involved in the takeover of this country in the 1960s came when they made all this hubbub about the disparity in voting here in the South. And of course, what was passed then was the so-called Voting Rights Act. Now, in 1968, King was assassinated because the communists, and I do mean communists, had already got the three things they needed to dismantle this country, to cause the turmoil. They had this so-called Civil Rights Act, they had the War on Poverty, and they had the Voting Rights Act. Now, all of a sudden, after 1968, the groups which had been so active and parading and advocating things began to just sort of disappear. You say, where did they go? Well, they became what you call non-governmental organizations. In other words, financed by the United States government, and their job was to head up and promote all of these little programs which would cause the Department of Health to grow, the Department of Education to grow, the Department of Welfare to grow, until you reach the point where you have the federalization of all health care, which is called socialized medicine, until you have the federal government controlling all the schools, federalized education, same thing with welfare. But what's more devastating than that is that once the federal government created the Federal Elections Commission, now notice it was done behind the so-called violence about Negroes voting in the South. Once they were able to do that, the next step was to find a way to expand the Federal Elections Commission to give it powers. The powers ultimately would be the power to say who can run and who can't run for office. The Federal Elections Commission right now is involved in the process of drawing up rules, regulations, codes, standards, and guidelines for candidates to run. And you don't qualify. You don't qualify. You don't meet their standards. They had this exact same system in Poland and in Czechoslovakia. They got one slate of candidates. Every candidate was a hand-picked communist. The communists got all the votes, won every election. It wouldn't have mattered whether they put 2 candidates up for the office or even 5. Everyone was a hand-picked communist. In this country, they're deceiving us by pretending that there are 2 parties when there's really only one head with 2 arms. We have to find a way to break that, to cut the connection between those party bosses who live in New York, Washington, D.C., but especially in London, Paris, and Zurich. We have to find a way to cut the connection between the party bosses and the candidates. Now, a man who's been picked by the party is not necessarily a communist or a socialist. There are very few communists and socialists in the government. Most of these men, especially those running, calling themselves conservatives, are simply immoral opportunists. They simply want to be elected and re-elected, and they really don't give a damn whether you suffer, whether this country goes down the tube. They're interested in staying in office, so they keep voting the way the party bosses want them to vote. No, doesn't mean that they're bad people, they're just immoral people. But they're opportunists. And if we provide the opportunity and make it possible for them to run and vote no on things, that's what they're going to do. Not because they believe in smaller government, but because they want to stay in office. So what we have to do is essentially make that possible. We have to make it possible for genuine pro-American candidates, for any party or for any office to be elected. We do that by creating an understanding among the American people about what the communists are doing and how they were doing it. So look at that particular program, what and how. If you understand what the communists are doing and how they were doing it, you understand how to solve the problem. We'll take a look at the phasing out of all this civil rights stuff and the building up of the bureaucracy. And we can find exactly the same pattern in creating other agencies. You recall the EPA, the so-called Environmental Protection Agency, was created after several years with the stroke of Richard Nixon's pen. The technique is to prophesy about a problem, manufacture the problem, and the solution to the problem is a measure used to help enslave the American people. With respect to the EPA, the bill had been put up several times in 1967 and 1968, 1969. It didn't pass. It was a huge expansion of the federal government. It did not pass. You remember what happened? Sure you do. Tankers began sinking. A tanker sinking off the coast of Venezuela, one off the coast of Scotland, one over here, and the press talked about oil pollution. We must do something about oil pollution. And so many tankers were sinking that finally Richard Nixon, with a stroke of his pen, created the EPA, and when he did, the tankers stopped sinking. You make a crisis, advocate the solution. This is precisely the same thing with the so-called energy department. The government wanted control of energy, set up a small department, and just keep increasing it till you have total control of all energy. The bills for the energy department didn't pass. You remember what happened? Sure you do. There was a fake, a completely fraudulent, so-called oil embargo. There was no Arab oil embargo of the United States. There was none. I recall the Shah of Iran came over here and was on the morning news. It was with Jane Pauley and Tom Brokaw or Barbara Walters and whoever her cohort was, maybe Devin Norble, I've forgotten who. But I was watching the interview, and this woman said to the Shah of Iran, this is at the height of the so-called energy crisis, 1973-74, she said, when are the Arabs going to lift the oil embargo against the United States? And the Shah said, we are not embargoing the United States. And she said, well, of course you are. We broadcast it. And I thought, how stupid can you be? And the Shah says, don't tell us what we're doing. We are embargoing Europe, Britain, Germany, and France, because of their policies discriminatory against the Arabs in favor of the Israelis. We are not embargoing the United States. The tankers are loading in our ports, as many as there ever were. The tankers are leaving our ports full of oil, bound for the United States. And he paused and said, I don't know what's happening to the tankers. There's something strange happening in this country. All you have to do is go back, find the date of that interview, and then look at the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Los Angeles Times to what Henry Kissinger said the next day. He accused the Shah of making reckless and irresponsible statements. There was no oil embargo of the United States. But the American people didn't know that. You recall how it ended. You wound up with tankers up and down the coast who weren't allowed to unload the oil. And if you think there was a gas shortage, you're wrong. Go to the Wall Street Journal. They list gasoline stocks, energy stocks every day. That is the volumes. And what you're going to discover is that when Richard Nixon and his crowd crimped the pipeline so that the gasoline could not come from the producers to the consumers, what do you do if you got a refinery and you can't ship your product? You begin to store it. And the more you store, the less facility you have to store things. And finally, all the tanks were full, and they began storing the gasoline in tank cars and wherever they could store it. And when everything was full, the refineries began to shut down. Not because they didn't have the gasoline. They began to shut down because there was no place to put it. And if you don't believe me, go to the Wall Street Journal and look at gasoline stocks and energy stocks, how much was on hand. And you'll find out that as the crisis deepened, there was more and more, and there was a glut waiting to be sold. But the point here is at the height of this so-called crisis, the Energy Department was created. And the man who was appointed the Energy Czar was James Schlesinger, and his claim to fame was simply that he had prophesied about an energy shortage years before. So when the crisis happened, he and his cronies were in to run the program. And all the government has done now is manipulated energy so as to increase the number of bureaucrats and the size and power of that agency. You make a crisis and advocate a solution. Well, that was energy. And the last monstrosity created was this Homeland Security. If you recall, Bill Clinton tried to pass the same bill. He tried several times, it didn't pass. Had the same provisions, it didn't pass. And like all the other shenanigans, a crisis was created. You recall 9/11. 9/11 supposedly was caused by Al-Qaeda or whatever group in Afghanistan. It turns out that our government was primarily responsible for creating this terrorist organization. After all, Al-Qaeda, along with Hamas and the other organizations, are departments of the United Nations. They're NGOs. Anyway, once that department was created, the next step is to find ways, means, and excuses to expand it and increase it so it oppresses the American people. If that process continues, you wind up with ration cards for gasoline and internal passports so that you cannot travel on a U.S. highway going from one state to another without passing through checkpoints. That's what that's all about. Now, this can be solved. This problem can be solved. And many of the problems, once you become aware that our government's creating the crises and advocating the solution, once you become aware of that, you'll begin to get candidates. And the candidates in the primaries is where you have to pick the winners. So in this election, or in any primary election, it is most important that if you're not registered to vote, you register and vote, because times are a-changing. We're getting candidates now who are pledged to vote no on any bill which would increase the size, the cost, the reach, or the power of government. If you've been waiting for a change, if you've been wanting to reduce the size of government and have been frustrated because no matter how you vote, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, in this election, you pick out the candidates who are not endorsed by the parties. Pick out those candidates, vote for them. And if they win the primaries, you will have a genuine choice in November. Do it here in the state of Tennessee. It'll be a shining light for the people in other states, and it won't be long before this growth in government will stop, turn around, and we can get back to living a good, free American life.